My name is Byron Johnson. I direct the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University, and I want to welcome you to this symposium. This is the brainchild of Gordon Melton, who you're going to hear from just in a few moments. Most all of our events are on campus. We also do events in Washington, D.C. Gordon approached me not too long ago and said, "Why is it that we discriminate against the city of Waco?" And I said, "I didn't know that we had been." He said, "We haven't done one talk in the community." And so, as you can see from the program, this is just the first of a series of symposia on Texas religion, and all of them will be off campus. So I'm glad someone showed up tonight, because if you didn't, we were going to have the rest of them on campus. We do a lot of research at the Institute for Studies of Religion, and we come at it from a lot of different perspectives. So we have sociologists, we have historians, political scientists, people in literature, people in medical humanities. We even have our own epidemiologists on staff. So we study religion from different perspectives. The one thing that brings us all together is that we're interested in studying religion. And we were fortunate enough to recruit Gordon several years ago, which is a major hire for Baylor. For those of you that don't know, Gordon Melton is kind of an icon in our field. And so it's really a coup for Baylor to bring him here. And he's going to go first tonight, but just some house cleaning things. Both of our speakers will go for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period after they're done. And then we'll take a break in between speakers. And but before I forget, we have symposia like this on a regular basis. We have another one coming up in 2 weeks that I did want to mention to you. It's going to be on campus in the Kaiser Auditorium. I didn't think to bring brochures. I wish I had, but we're bringing in Tom Farr, who's one of our non-resident people at Georgetown University, whose area is religious freedom. And religious freedom is becoming a major topic within our shop, as well as the one in Georgetown, and we're going to be partnering together on a number of initiatives, including a conference in Rome in December, celebrating the 1700th anniversary of the Edict of Milan. So that one's way off campus. You're all invited. But that may be a little bit of an expensive trip. But you can hear Tom Farr next week talk about the response of Christians to what we see as a loss of freedom throughout the world. So we're expecting a packed house for that event. Well, let me get us off to a start by introducing my dear friend and a real giant in the field. Baylor is very fortunate to have Gordon Melton with us. We lured him from Santa Monica. I told him that their climate really couldn't very much compete with that we could offer here in Waco. So Gordon moved here, and we had like 80 days of 100-degree heat when he first arrived here. But it is a great honor and a privilege to have Gordon Melton at Baylor. So Gordon, come open us up.
Shortly after moving here several years ago, I decided I needed to get some orientation on what it was like to be in Texas and to be a Texan. I had never thought of myself as one who would ever do that. I started my college career with a quarter at Texas A&M and decided that I wouldn't fit there very well. Went back home to Alabama to Birmingham Southern for the rest of my college. But lo and behold, circle been completed, and here I am. The way I get a handle on new situations is to start looking at history. So it was kind of natural that I began to accumulate some books on Texas religious history, and part of what I discovered into that process was that we had some very, very fine people who had been working on Texas history. If you have a chance sometime to delve into the different religious communities here in Texas, you'll find that there's some very, very fine scholars who've devoted themselves to turning out material about the Methodists and the Baptists and the Lutherans and the Episcopalians, etc. What they haven't done is to try to pull all of that together and to show how the different religious communities have grown together, have related to each other over time, and the varying roles that they have played in both the life of building the religious community in Texas and how very unique it is in terms of the rest of the country, and the role that it's had upon the secular community. So in this first set of symposia that we're going to be having this fall, we're going to bring together some of these people who've been working on various aspects of religion. And I'll get you ready for the second half. Our speaker in the second half of the program, when we got together, the committee got together to start planning these, his name was at the top of our list. We seem to all have been familiar with him and his work, and we all felt very, very fortunate that when we contacted him, he agreed to come and be a part of this and to be part of our first program. What I'm going to do tonight is try to give you something of an overview of Texas religion as I've come to understand it, and kind of set the context for some of the talks that will be coming in the weeks ahead. There are two ways of looking at Texas religion. In the first instance, we can begin with the observation of the singular dominance of Texas by three religious communities: the Southern Baptist, the United Methodist, and the Roman Catholics. Their membership taken together account for about half of the population, with a few additional groups like the Christian Church and Churches of Christ, the National Baptist, Presbyterians, two Lutheran groups, the Episcopalians, several Pentecostal groups, filling out the next tier of membership. One could, with authority, tell the story of Texas religion by simply telling the story of these dozen or so groups and do very little, if any, injustice to the story as a whole. This approach reflects the reality of religion in America at the national level, where over half of the population of the country have chosen to be members of a mere 23 denominations, each of which has at least 1 million members. These groups are all Christian, representing the spectrum of Christian belief and practice. Their position is strengthened by some 40 additional denominations that have at least 100,000 members, a few of which are in that 950,000 membership range that are going to reach 1 million very, very shortly. The Assemblies of God, the Seventh-day Adventists, for example. But these additional 40 groups reflect the same spectrum of opinion and belief as the big 23. The worldview represented by these 23 denominations, and most of you could, if you sat and thought about it for a few minutes, probably come up with the list of what those 23 groups are, is identical with the worldview held by the additional 900 Christian denominations in America, which together make up about 70 to 80% of the American population. Now, I brought a little show and tell with me tonight. Every 10 years, there's a group of people who together are called the Association of American Religious Statisticians. They're actually the people from all of the larger denominations who contribute the statistical section to the denomination's yearbook. They keep up with the membership figures around the country for these larger groups. They come together once every 10 years and do a census of American religion, and they put out a map. And this is that map for 2010. Now, the red, you can probably tell the bags. Oh.
We have great technology skills, don't we?
There you go. The orange is Lutherans. The green, which is you can't see much of, are the Methodists. The gray are the Mormons. This is the most recent. If you have looked at this map for, say, 1960 or better still, even 1950, this area here, with the exception of just the southern tip of Florida and a little bit of the coast of Louisiana and Florida, would have all been red. From New Mexico all the way over to Virginia, Washington, D.C. That's, by the way, this is the Bible Belt. That's where that thing comes from. What has happened here, several things. In 1950, this green swash would have gone all the way over to Nebraska and Kansas. That was where the Methodists were concentrated. They're still concentrated there, but their place in the country has been diluted as population has grown. The Lutheran swash would have gone all the way from Montana all the way to Chicago, which is here. And that represents some of the changes. Here in Texas, please notice that what used to be an all-red state is now turning blue. It's doing it as Roman Catholicism is growing from the coast and heading northward. And these areas reflect these urban centers that we know of as Houston, San Antonio, Austin, etc., which are becoming heavily Roman Catholic. And this is changing not only the religious nature of Texas, but the political nature.
Is that it? Can we hold it up for you?
Of the 900 Christian denominations in America, no less than 400 of them are active in Texas, and while dissenting on minor sectarian points, generally find their place in the spectrum of opinion of the larger groups. 70 to 80% of Texans find themselves adhering to a Christian worldview as starting ground for public debate and will affirm their general agreements more than emphasize their differences. At the same time, they will disagree vehemently on those relatively few issues which the larger groups have lifted up for debate. In this case, most recently, those issues have been abortion, homosexuality, racism, war and peace, and poverty. The essence of the spectrum of opinion within and between the larger churches reflects the society in general. The larger churches choosing to debate an issue will make it a public debate. The smaller groups can choose only to participate in that debate or not. It is extremely rare for one of the smaller Christian denominations, not to mention the smaller non-Christian groups, to place their issues on the public agenda. One can see the spectrum of public opinion reflected in the various stances taken by the different Christian churches. Texas is, for example, home to the largest single gay lesbian congregation in the country, the Cathedral of Hope, a congregation in Dallas that is part of the United Church of Christ, generally considered the most liberal of the larger 23 denominations. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Episcopal Church, and the Presbyterian Church USA, representatives of what is generally called liberal Protestantism, have all welcomed practicing gays into their membership and into their ordained ministry. In the middle of the spectrum, one finds the United Methodists and the Roman Catholics, both of whom oppose homosexual behavior, but have welcomed gays and lesbians into membership and celibate gays and lesbians into their ministry. Further to the right, Southern Baptist and Missouri Synod Lutherans oppose homosexuality and do not welcome openly gay and lesbian people to either membership or leadership. On the most conservative end of the spectrum, the argument would be over civil rights for gay people. That is, as you move from the more liberal end of the religious spectrum into the conservative end, the arguments shift. And what the conservative groups argue about is the treatment of people with AIDS at hospitals, gay marriage in the secular realm, or inclusion of gay couples in open housing legal provisions. So that's one way of looking at religion, is to just take the big groups that are setting the debates and look at them. The second way of viewing American religion in general and Texas religion in particular focuses on the religious pluralism we experience. America is home to some 2,500 different religious groups, some 1,000 Christian, some 1,500 non-Christian, depending upon definitions, including 300 to 400 groups which use Christian language and symbols, but would not be recognized or welcomed into fellowship with the larger Christian groups. We can think about the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Latter-day Saints. They have particular doctrines that separate them from other recognizable Christian churches, or the Christian Scientists in the Unity School of Christianity, which uses Christian language, but who pour into that language such different meanings that it makes any conversation very, very difficult. Throughout American history, non-Christian groups, most notably the Jewish community, have existed. But since World War II, all of the larger religious groups from around the world have developed significant, or at least measurable, followings in America. Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism all can now show up on national polls, while Baha'ism, Taoism, Shinto, and traditional Chinese religion are all represented, though difficult to locate if you don't know how to seek them out. One state has Buddhism as the largest religious community in the state, though divided into numerous denominations, that being the state of Hawaii. All of these groups are represented in Texas. Austin even has the third largest Buddhist community relative to its overall size of any city in America. Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Austin all have visible Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, and other non-Christian communities, though of course none of these communities are in any position to challenge the overwhelming Christian dominance of Texas or the cities in which they're located. Along with the classical world religions, Texas has a number of representatives of what is termed variously metaphysical, New Age, and esoteric religion. Esoteric groups range from the more accommodationist Christian Science and Unity churches to a variety of psychic-oriented spiritualist groups like Scientology and the nature-centered Wiccan groups. To say the least, we do not have a handle on these groups yet. They are the most understudied groups in American religion. Almost all of the visible centers are in urban areas, and some of the largest esoteric groups developed as mail-order religions, and while quite large, one thinks of the Amorc Rosicrucians, are all but invisible in terms of driving around and seeing any evidence that they are part of the community. The one esoteric group that has grown large and visible is Freemasonry. It was among the first of the new religions founded in Texas, and also demonstrates vividly the problems of counting esoteric groups, as many of them have an interlocking membership with the larger Christian churches. Finally, there is that community of unbelief, those groups which have grown up since the 16th century by challenging initially key Christian doctrines, and then in the 19th century the very belief in God and practice of religion itself. The deists and Unitarians, who denied the Christian doctrine of the Trinity and the viability of meaningful prayer, were the first to emerge. However, by the middle of the 19th century, the first atheist groups were emerging, and Texas was home to a set of the first such groups in the American Republic, based in the German communities founded in the hill country of central Texas. Today, they make up about 5% of the population. And by saying that they make up 5% of the population, it means that there are more unbelievers in the country than there are Muslims Buddhists, and Hindus put together. So if you add up the Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists, you get about 4%. With about 5% of the country is atheist. What's interesting about that figure is that in whole numbers, the number hasn't changed all that much. It's about 15 million. If you went back to 1900, there were probably about 15 million unbelievers in the country then, except with the smaller population, they made up a much larger percentage of the population. When we add up the small Christian groups, the classical world religions, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, etc., the esoteric groups, and the unbelievers, we are dealing with the others, about 20 to 25% of the population. 1,500 groups that represent all possible positions on every religious and non-religious issue we can imagine. While no one group has a great deal of power in itself, together they are an important community, and they exist in such cordial relations with the dominant community, a key aspect of American religious life. Periodically, of course, they make an important contribution as members of these communities rise to positions of importance. For example, the Christadelphians is a small Christian movement that counts its membership in Texas in the low thousands. But one of their members, a fellow by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson, made it to the top. The question of the hour, however, is how did we get this way? How did we become a country of 2,500 different religious groups that exist in relative harmony? And how did Texas become a state with 500, 600, 700 groups? We haven't counted all of them yet, but we know that there's at least that many. I think there's some more. We began in 1834 with Padre Jose Antonio Diaz de Leon, the one remaining Franciscan friar in East Texas. His death that year brings to an end the several centuries of Spanish Catholic organized activity in Texas. We note, of course, that at this time in El Paso, the Catholic community is still active and vibrant, but it's also not a part of Texas. It's a part of New Mexico at this point, and will be part of Colorado before it becomes part of Texas. In the wake of Padre Diaz's death, there is no active congregation of believers, nor any ordained Christian minister or priest in the whole of Texas. Mexico is experiencing the first of several waves of anti-Catholicism, which provide the context for the rise to power of a fellow named Santa Anna. Population is approximately 35,000, 70% Anglo, 20% Mexican, 10% African. That is, the population of Texas in 1834 is such that if you took half the population of Waco and spread it all over Texas, that's what you've got. No cities of what we would call cities today. The future cities are still very small towns at this point. As the Western European and African settlers have poured into Texas, the great majority are not members of any church. Less than 20% of Americans were affiliated with a Christian church, and they are only united by being opposed to a Catholic establishment. As the Anglos move into Texas, preachers from various Protestant groups will follow them, at least come and visit as missionaries, and begin evangelism, though only a few small, low-key congregations begin to meet. Milton Estelle, a Cumberland Presbyterian, is among the first to arrive. James Porter Stevenson, the first Methodist. Peter Fullenwider, the first Old School Presbyterian. And then the erratic Daniel Parker, very famous Baptist preacher from Texas. He's what today we would call a primitive Baptist, but he preached a doctrine that shows up in the history books as one of the odd positions in American religion. It's called the two-seed in the spirit, predestinarian Baptist. They believed that at the time that you were born, that God put one or two seeds within you, and that predetermined whether you would be saved or not, right from the get-go. You didn't have much choice about it. Parker understood in the 1830s that you could not form a Protestant congregation in Texas. That was against the law, but he thought he had found a loophole. So before he left Illinois to come to Texas, he founded a congregation in Illinois and then picked up the members and moved the congregation to Texas. That's how Protestantism kind of began its organized life here. And then there's a man named Anson West who lives here. We'll know Anson because of his early leadership in the state government, Baptist, but he's also the fellow who writes to Louisiana to ask that Freemasonry be organized. And he is, along with Sam Houston, one of the founders of Freemasonry. After the formation of the Texas Republic, the major church groups began to send missionaries to Texas. At the time that the Texas Republic is formed, of course, Texas is a foreign country. And it's such that the Methodists and the Episcopalians will send their first foreign missionaries from the eastern U.S. to Texas as their first destination before they send missionaries to other parts of the world. They will come in here to Texas as a foreign missionary target. And the other communities begin to arise slowly. The Methodists, the Baptists, both brands of Presbyterians, and the Campbellites, that is the Church of Christ and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, form their first congregations. Most of them, if not their first congregation, their second congregation is always in Galveston. And from there they spread to other parts of the state. Galveston, of course, for the 19th century is a major center of activity, both politically and religiously in the state. Catholicism, the Bishop of New Orleans, and it's interesting that it's New Orleans, not someplace in Mexico, sends a priest to reestablish Catholicism and to begin to lay claim to all the property that had formerly been Catholic mission centers, Catholic churches, which he was fairly successful. And leadership will come to a re-emerging Catholicism that re-emerges alongside Protestantism in the Texas Republic from Italy, France, and Germany, rather than from Spain and Mexico. The new republic is financially marginal. Its main wealth is that it has a lot of land. And so Stephen Austin initiates a program that will carry through the next decades, long after he is no longer around, a program to build colonies. He makes one or two trips to Europe to begin to recruit colonists to come to Texas for the promise of free to low-priced land. And when these colonists arrive, they're generally given a whole section of the county in which they can settle, divide up among themselves to create farms, a town, etc. The first groups to come are German, and they settle in what today we know as the Hill Country. Here is where ethnic Catholicism begins to emerge. German Catholics, Polish Catholics. Interestingly enough, the very first Polish Catholic church in the United States is founded here in Texas. A little place called Panna Maria, which is southeast of San Antonio, about halfway to the coast south of San Antonio. The first of the communities, however, are German. Fredericksburg is among them. It is soon followed by Bertina and Bernie and Comfort. But along with Catholicism, Lutheranism is founded. It's, first of all, the brand of Lutheranism from Saxony, which we call the Evangelical Church. But there are several different brands of it because both Saxons and Slavs come into central Texas. And this begins to create division. Most of the folks fall into an evangelical church life or fall into a pietist Lutheran life. But a group of them become attached to a new church that's founded up in the St. Louis area called the Missouri Synod. And among the first churches that are formed are churches that adhere to the new Missouri Synod. As I said, among the first organizations founded in the state are Freemasonry. And by and large, Freemasonry has quite a growth potential in the decades prior to the Civil War. By the time of the Civil War, there are more Masonic lodges in Texas than there are churches of any particular group. They are all over. By the beginning of the 1850s, there's some 35 of them. No church has that many congregations at that time. Judaism will also get its start among the residents of Galveston when the Republic is formed in the mid-1830s. There are some Jewish families, and they slowly begin to hold meetings in homes, finally get a rabbi in, and by the 1840s are ready to organize the first cemetery, and shortly thereafter they organize the first synagogue. Something you learn about studying Judaism is that when new Jewish communities are formed, organizing, buying land for a cemetery is more important than organizing a synagogue. And that's part of it. Here in Waco, we have one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in the state. It's over just north of the Baylor campus. You want to see how important the Jewish organization is. Now, the most interesting thing I found about the early settlers, when they begin to bear fruit and the Germans start moving here in a large way, the majority of the Germans who move in the first wave of immigration in the 1840s are actually products of the German Enlightenment. They're atheists, to put it bluntly. They organized 3 communities, Bertina, Bernie, and Comfort. They actually organized a couple of more, but those are the ones that survived and became the strongest. These communities are really kind of interesting because they focused upon learning. They had very fine schools. Most of them were multilinguistic. The people who lived there spoke Latin, spoke German and English, and maybe some other languages as well. But they had some interesting rules. Among the rules of those 3 communities was that no church could be formed in town. When later in the century, enough Roman Catholics moved in to where churches were something that they wanted, they had to build them outside of town. The church that was built at Bernie is still there. If you go today, that church is inside the city limits because Bernie has grown physically over the years. But there's a very beautiful church. As a matter of fact, if you look on the brochures for this meeting, that church that's on the front cover, that's the Bernie Catholic Church, St. Peter's Church in Bernie, which the story of which we will come back to because besides being an early Catholic parish in Texas, it has an important history in more recent years. Now, after the Civil War, the process of development continues. The real issue at the time of the Civil War is the African American population. Among the 2 issues that come to the fore at the time that the Republic is founded are religion and African Americans. The Mexican government wanted no churches but the Catholic Church in its land, and also had outlawed slavery. So the Anglos who were moving in and who were now the great majority of residents of Texas had brought slaves with them, and they wanted to keep them. And during the 1820s, there were a number of different laws that were passed that allowed them to do that. Some of the laws just postponed the enactment of Mexican laws. Other laws redefined slaves as indentured servants, or some term like that, by which they could continue. After the Republic was set up, slavery wasn't a problem. It continued through the 1850s. There were very few black churches founded during this time. Slave masters that were part of Christian church would bring their slaves with them to church. Here in Waco, in 1845, the Methodist and the Baptist in town organized a congregation, separate congregation for their slave members. It met out on the edge of the Brazos River for 15 years, out of doors, which you could do here most of the year fairly comfortably. At the end of the Civil War, however, this becomes a problem because with freedom, the control of the churches is a whole different kind of ballgame. Neither the Southern Methodists nor the Southern Baptists particularly wanted to continue their black membership, and so those members became free to do as they pleased. There were several interesting things that happened to them. Among the Baptists, the Northern Baptists, the American Baptist churches as it's called today, organized congregations in the South. So some of the black Baptist members went with the American Baptists, and they were very happy there for 10, 20 years. But then the issue began to arise over the control of literature and who would write it and who would pay salaries. Those kinds of issues eventually lead the black Baptists to organize. They organize what comes to be known as the National Baptist Convention. It takes them several decades to get to that point. They organize a number of conventions along the way that are regional. National Baptists finally organized around 1895. The Methodists go through a much more tension-filled history that starts in 1863 when the U.S. government invites the Methodists to North Carolina and then eventually to South Carolina and Georgia as they take control of the Atlantic seaboard. And they give the churches that belong to the Methodists to the now freed slaves. After the war, there are several black-led Methodist churches that had formed in the northern states during the antebellum era. These churches moved south and began to claim the black members, the African Methodist Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. What happens between 1865 and 1870 is that 4 churches arise to claim the black members. And in the South, there's 200,000 of them. And they're pretty evenly divided between the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Zion Church, the Northern White Church, which is the original Methodist church in this country, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and a new church called the CME, the Colored Methodist Church, which today is known as the Christian Methodist Church. So all of a sudden there are 4 Methodist churches competing for the black members and for the property that goes with it. Now here in Waco there was no property, so it wasn't a problem. And the majority of the members went to the Methodist Episcopal Church North, the white church, and Mount Zion United Methodist Church, which I think is on 19th Street, I remember, 17th or 19th. is that congregation, the original black congregation that was formed by the Methodists. A couple of blocks away is a larger Baptist church, which is the original Baptist church formed by the black members of that early original group. So these churches began to add to the diversity. In different places, they're able to claim property. Trinity Church in Houston gives its black members their property. Later realized they made a big mistake. They should never have done that because first chance they got, they left the denomination and went elsewhere. And in later years, grew to be as large as Trinity was. Trinity, of course, no longer the largest Methodist church in Houston. But such is life. Later in the 19th century, we get then the addition of a number of sectarian groups into the state. Now, the Methodists and the Baptists are the two largest groups, and it's splinters of these two groups that are coming in. The first set of groups are called the holiness churches. Methodism had always had an emphasis upon the holy life, and they had a belief in something called the baptism of the Holy Spirit, or sanctification. They held out the idea that one could become perfect in love in this life. That was a doctrine that was challenged by the middle of the 19th century. But in the South, including Texas, there were a number of exponents of it. And they began to form a set of independent camp meetings around the countryside. Here in Texas, the first holiness churches began to form in the 1860s and then continued on. There were a couple of important churches that formed in the northern part of Texas, north of Dallas, that took the name Independent Holiness Church. There were two denominations that both had the word independent and holiness in the title, and they're easy to confuse with each other. One of them was led by a woman, Mary Lee Cagle, a very famous preacher who'd come to Texas from Alabama. And that church is the one that eventually will merge with a group out in California that called themselves the Nazarenes and formed here in 1914 the Church of the Nazarene, which was headquartered in a little town not far from Denton called Peniel, Texas. The Texas group is important because it becomes part of a movement within the holiness group called the Fire Baptized movement. Some of the holiness people finally figured out that living a holy life has its drawbacks. The main drawback is that you get focused upon the minutiae. Most Christians, without a lot of urging, lead a pretty decent moral life. But if you're going to be perfect, then you start focusing upon minutiae of behavior, little points like the hem length of your dress or whether or not to wear a tie. I remember I ran into one group when I was first getting started in my studies in North Carolina, the Emmanuel Holiness Church. And it was a primary belief of the Emmanuel Holiness Church that ties were a sign of unholy ostentation. And no member of the church would wear ties. And I said, that's the group I want to be a part of. But for all the wrong reasons. So anyway, the Fire Baptized group came along and said, well, the emphasis should not be upon this minutia of holy living. It should be upon the power that comes with life in the Spirit. And so the Fire Baptized group gets started. This will later supply a basis upon which the Pentecostal movement will emerge. Among the Baptists, the main movement that emerges is Adventist, particularly the Seventh-day Adventists, who come into Texas in the 1870s. established their first congregations in San Antonio and Dallas, and began to build their movement. They have already gone through the great disappointment when Christ didn't return as their founder had predicted in the 1840s, and we're now focused upon healthy living, vegetarianism, and the worship on the Sabbath, on Saturday. They had a slow start here in Texas, but once they got going, they not only grew, but then spawned other groups as well, as we shall see. Finally, the Pentecostals emerge. Pentecostalism starts in Kansas, but quickly moves to Texas, and Texas becomes its second birthing place. Charles Fox Parham, who founds the Pentecostal movement, settles in Dallas, or settles in Houston within a couple of years of the movement getting started in Kansas, and he loses control of the place in Topeka where the movement originates, and he makes Houston his home. And here he runs into a holiness preacher named Seymour, William Joseph Seymour, and Seymour will receive the message of speaking in tongues as a sign of the baptism of the Holy Spirit, will take that to Los Angeles, and from Los Angeles it would spread around the world. But as the Pentecostal movement develops, Texas is one of the places where it develops its strongest centers. It's headquartered out of California and out of Missouri, but its strength is here. When the Assemblies of God is formed, for example, as a national organization, 20% of all of its ministers are residents of Texas. That's how important that movement is. And finally, the other thing that happens in the late 19th century is the development of esotericism. Freemasonry has grown quite large in Texas at this time, and several other esoteric movements begin to move into the states. Spiritualism begins in Galveston and spreads out from there. First spiritualist church is in Galveston, and as I understand it, the building is still there, though that the spiritualists no longer occupy it. Christian Science begins in Corpus Christi. Once Christian Science is founded in the 1870s in Massachusetts, it spreads nationally very, very quickly. Within 5 years, it has centers all over the country. First one said is in Corpus Christi here in the state. And then a movement called Swedenborgianism. Emanuel Swedenborg is a Swedish seer who becomes very popular in 19th century America. We know him because of a fellow named Johnny Appleseed, who was a member of the Swedenborgian Church and who used to travel the countries planting apple seeds, but he also carried Swedenborg's books with him. Now, Swedenborg wrote books that were this thick, and he would carry these books around with him, and when he met people who were open to it, he'd just tear out a chapter and give it to them, and that's how he spread Swedenborgianism. We had a leader here in Texas in the 1890s by the name of Thomas Nugent, who became a popular political leader at one point, got 25% of the vote for governor state, but he was one of the leaders of the Swedenborgian movement. So by the time that the 20th century begins, we've already got a pretty diverse situation here. Now, at this point in time, there's still only about 30% of the population who are members of any religious group, be it Methodist, Baptist, or Catholic. It's not until World War II that half of Texans become church members. It's a very, very slow-going process. So there's a lot of room for different groups to grow and recruit. The real problem is that Texas is a rural countryside, and different groups that are not part of the majority, need almost assuredly an urban center to have a dense enough population where they can find the critical mass to form a group. So while there are a lot of groups, they're very concentrated in cities. They're in Galveston, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth. overwhelmingly. It's not until after World War II that these groups begin to appear in other parts of the country. During the early 20th century, and where am I time-wise?
It's about 8 till.
So I need to sum up what's happening here. All right. Let me just very, very quickly run through the 20th century. During the 20th century, a couple of interesting things happened. First of all, Texas switches from being a predominantly rural country somewhere around World War II or shortly there, the 50s, becomes kind of 50-50 rural-urban. Today, Texas is 85% urban and only 15% rural. And that provides the kind of context in which a number of different groups can form. At the same time, the population has grown. In 1940, there were only 6 million people in Texas. Today, there are 26 million people. So the number of people that can form different religious groups has grown tremendously. Since World War II, Texas went from, the other thing that happens, besides the changing population, is the changing legal situation. There are a number of different laws on the books that promote or inhibit the growth of groups. For example, there in the 1920s, a set of anti-spiritualist laws are passed that stunt the growth of spiritualism, which is a very popular movement in different places. But in 1965, the most important legal change in terms of religion occurred, and this was the new Immigration Act. In the 1920s, we had passed a law that inhibited immigration from Asia and from Southern and Eastern Europe. We favored Northern and Western European immigration, made it almost impossible for Asians to get here. In 1965, President Kennedy and then President Johnson renegotiated that law, and this was all part of the Vietnam War era because Kennedy was wanting to build a coalition of Southeast Asian nations to help with the Vietnam War. Those nations said, you want us to help you and you treat us like dirt as far as your immigration laws. That's what caused the change. But what it did was it put Asia on the same immigration quotas as Western Europe. And all of a sudden, Asians began to move into the country. The first year, there were only 3 months. It was passed in October of 65, but the quotas were almost full just in those 3 months of people waiting to get into the country. Ever since then, the quotas have not only been filled, they have been doubled. That is, once you get here, you can bring your family and they're not part of the quota. So it meant that from India, for example, you could bring 14,000 people in every year. All of the quotas from Asia have been filled every year since then. During the first Bush administration in the early 1990s, those quotas were raised by a third. 1993, I think, was the first year that went into effect. So that meant large numbers of Asians could come into the country. That set up the stage for the development of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. The largest Islamic community in the country is Indo-Pakistani, and that legal change, which did not affect the Middle East that much, did affect Pakistan and allowed the Islamic community to develop. Well, let me stop there. There's some interesting stories that come out of the change of law situation. I will tie up one loose end, if I may, and then I'll stop and we'll take a few questions. Getting back to Bernie, that St. Peter's Church in Bernie, interesting church. To show you how things had changed, in the 1990s, the St. Peter's Church in Bernie, which had not been allowed to be part of the city, had grown to the point where it needed a new sanctuary. The St. Peter's Church that you see there no longer served the community of the congregation. It just wasn't big enough, so they laid plans to tear down the church and build a big new sanctuary. The city of Bernie, which was no longer atheist, decided they didn't want that to happen. This was now a historical monument. They didn't want the Catholic Church to tear it down. Clinton had just passed the Freedom of Religion Restoration Act, and under that act, the Catholic Church sued the city of Bernie for the right to handle its own church property as it saw fit. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The city of Bernie won, and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was struck from the books. That was the case that did that. There's a lot of other fallout from that as well. But that's at least in outline how we got to be such a diverse religious state. Thank you. Now, I ate up most of my question time with the talks, but there's time for, I think, a couple, one or two. Yes, sir.
Why do religions start in Galveston? And thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you. Galveston was kind of the capital city. It was the big seaport. It was going to be. It should have been what Houston is, and it serves that purpose up until 1900. And then in 1900, of course, the big storm took it out, and everything moves to Houston. But that's why everybody's there, because it's the biggest population center and the biggest mercantile center in the state. Yes, sir.
Is there anything unique about Texas? Texans like to think about themselves being unique. Is there anything unique about Texas that brings about more diversity in religion?
I think the size of the state is one of it. It's the big population more than the big land that's part of it. And I would invite you to hold that question for a few years, because that's one of the questions I'm trying to do the most thinking about. I tend to be very hesitant in terms of ascribing uniqueness to passing cultural fads and the like, and but it's the kind of question that I'm trying to think about, and maybe in a few more years I'll be able to give you a better answer than that. But it's very obvious that the density of that the size of the population and the density and crowding into the cities is a very important part of what's unique here. And there are some other uniquenesses we didn't get around to, but we'll do that in future times. Yes, sir.
I've heard that for years the Freemasons have fought the description of them as being a religion of any sort, and you seem to say that as a fact. Is that generally assumed or accepted?
No, it actually is a intense point of debate among people in esoteric studies. It's quite obvious that in understanding the development of esoteric religion, you have to key the Masons into the story. They are the building block that moves us from alchemy and Rosicrucianism into theosophy and ritual magic and Wicca and the larger esoteric religions. Some esoteric groups describe themselves as religious, some don't. Just to look at them from the outside in terms of the tools of religious studies, they appear to be a religion. But at the same time, there are all kinds of problems. I think the basic problem was that esotericism starts in the 16th and 17th century at a time where being outwardly and to get up and profess that you are a believer in esotericism gets you in trouble. significant trouble, jail, hung, head chopped off, things like that. So that denying religious status was a strategy for survival for both Freemasons and other esoteric groups at that time. And then in other parts of the country, it began to be privileged. 35% of the French are members of esoteric groups. And most of those esoteric groups, well over half of them, deny their religious status. They had an interesting situation develop when the Solar Temple committed the suicides back in the 90s. They had developed as not a religious group, very plainly so. French government defined them as a cult, and hence a bad religious group. When they got into court, they discovered that the main anti-cult authority, a psychiatrist who had been testifying in the cult cases, was a member of a rival group to the Solar Temple. And this came out in the midst of things. So it's a very complicated situation, but you're right, but it is an interesting one. Well, I need to stop here, and we need to have our break and enjoy some of these refreshments.